Long time no see, you beautiful bastards. Raz here again, and with so much good going on in the world. I decided it was time to make something a little different, and something that has been on my mind as of late. The top 10 RPGs of all time. Now, to be clear, this list is like all lists and that you can find on the internet, and it's pretty biased. And it actually was really difficult to make. Many of these games were battling for their spots, but I think in the end, for me anyway, it's pretty accurate. Also, bear in mind that I'm not including MMORPGs in this list, even though MMORPGs are the main focus of my channel. But they kind of deserve their own video, which is a video that's in my queue to make. And it'll be a top 5 list, because let's be real, most MMORPGs these days suck anus. But without further ado, let's just do the drop and reveal my top 10 RPGs of all time.
I am Razio.
Now, for those of you who grew up in the 90s, you'll remember two things: getting a wooden spoon broken over your ass, and Secret of Mana. The Mana series has quite a few entries, even one more recent I have yet to play, which I intend on playing soon. However, there was something about this game that I can't quite put my finger on that makes it stand out from all of the others in the series that I have played. I mean, the music is amazing, the world is rich and colorful, yet the story itself is pretty simple and isn't necessarily like a jaw-dropping narrative of any kind. So what is it? Well, the combat's smooth and unique when you compare it to other games of its time. The character development and depth isn't anything to write home about, but the best way I can describe this game and why I keep going back to it and playing it decades later is the game is simply enchanting. Like that sweet girl in church that seems so innocent and kind, but it's probably better not to know what makes her seem that way. If you haven't played this game, I highly recommend you give it a go. Don't get the Steam version with the updated graphics though, it's absolute balls. The game needs to be played in its original iteration. I'd recommend the SNES Classic version or just emulate it with an SNES emulator. Secret of Mana is a game we will most likely never see the likes of again in this modern age of gaming. The Legend of Zelda series is a favorite of many gamers all over the world. Dozens and dozens of games exist in the franchise, and it's no surprise why it keeps pulling other players in. However, there are a few titles in this series that tend to hold a deeper place in our hearts than others. A Link to the Past for the SNES is definitely one of these. Link to the Past was the first real RPG that I ever played as a kid. I mean, I played the first Zelda, the one for NES, a few times when I was really young at my babysitter's house. In fact, my little brother and I broke into their house when they weren't home a few times just to play it. But breaking and entering and possible arson charges aside, we were both too young to really understand the genre back then or what we were even supposed to do in the game. That all changed when I made a friend in 5th grade who had this game, A Link to the Past, and we stayed up all night, countless nights, trying to beat the game. I was probably the first guy actually to befriend this kid based off him having, Link to the Past, and not the fact that his mom was a total MILF. Link to the Past is a masterpiece in the Zelda franchise. The smooth gameplay, and at the time, the amazing graphics were an instant draw-in. The dungeons were complex and had the perfect combination of puzzles and difficulty curve as you went along. And not to mention the panty dropper of a soundtrack it had. I mean, listen to the Dark World, man. This shit is fire. Link to the Past will always stay in my heart as one of the greatest games for the SNES and one of the best entries in the Zelda franchise overall. To this day, you can still see it streamed online, as well as mods for it, which completely randomize the game. I still go back and play it myself every few years just to remind me of a time when we weren't living in our own Dark World version of Orwell's 1984. Such a nostalgic and fantastic game. Play it if you haven't. The Final Fantasy series is a staple in the RPG genre, so it should come as no surprise that we hit the first one here that has made it into the top 10 RPGs of all time. Final Fantasy IX was an entry that, when it came out, I wasn't expecting much, given of how much I disliked Final Fantasy VIII.
It's a piece of shit.
And its strange character design and art was quite a large step away from what we saw in games like Final Fantasy IV, 6, and 7, and even 8. However, I was blown away by what this game actually turned out to be. As with most Final Fantasy games, the music was amazing and set the tone for the game perfectly. The graphics were by far the best in the series up to that point, and it pushed the limits of the PlayStation 1. But where Final Fantasy IX truly shined was its amazingly deep and riveting storyline, its character development, and the fact that Garnet is the absolute ultimate tight-bodied waifu. Yeah, I know she's 15 in the game, but I was 16 when 9 came out, so it was legal. Get off my ass. Final Fantasy IX, in my opinion, is the last numbered Final Fantasy that was truly a masterpiece through and through. Some will argue 10 is, but I disagree. 9 to me is the last Final Fantasy that truly stuck with the OG Final Fantasy formula, while also changing things up to make things feel new and fresh. Play Final Fantasy IX if you haven't, you won't regret it. Few games can make the impact not only on its own franchise, but on the gaming world as a whole, as The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time did. Ocarina of Time was the first 3D Zelda game, and it broke the idea of what a Zelda game could even be. Few films or games are capable of telling a story that incorporates time travel, by the way, and still maintain a coherent story, let alone even a good one. Ocarina of Time accomplishes just that, while also delivering what is arguably the most memorable soundtrack in the entire franchise. The dungeons were complex, even bordering on brutal. Hello, Water Temple. And the items and boss fights brought back both classics from the original titles as well as some completely new ideas. Let's also not forget that playing the ocarina itself has spawned many offshoots of players doing entire songs from films or other games on a Nintendo 64 controller. It's also worth mentioning that Link in this game is a total Chad. It could probably... he practically starts a harem if he wanted, and it's pretty much comprised of sexy fish women, the princess, and a stereotypical woman that has a horse fetish. This game is an undisputed masterpiece and is arguably the best Zelda game ever made to this day. So, Nintendo, get working on that remaster for the next-gen Nintendo console, please. The one that's coming out after the Switch. It's time. Here we are at number 6, and it's another Final Fantasy title and another banger that was launched as Final Fantasy III in the United States on the SNES. Final Fantasy VI managed to do something that had not been done in a JRPG before, at least not anyone that I had played. It took a large, absolutely huge cast of characters that by the end of the game, you have full control over which of them is in your party while simultaneously managing to give each character, outside of the 3 special optional characters you can find later in the game, rich backstories and very deep character development while also not having a main protagonist other than the world of the game itself. Some people argue Terra's the main protagonist, and I would say that she is in the first half of the game, and then it kind of tapers off. It's much different, a big step away from, like Cecil being the main character in Final Fantasy IV. Add on top of that the unique Magicite system and how each individual character has their own set of moves and skills, and you have a JRPG that's really hard to top. And as with all Final Fantasy games, and I sound like a broken record now, the soundtrack is gorgeous and sets the tone of its world, and the story beats perfectly. I played Final Fantasy IV as a younger kid, and I didn't think Square at the time could one-up it. But man, Final Fantasy VI eclipses IV in nearly every single way. The game also somehow manages to make the primary villain so masterfully Joker-esque that the only difference between his character and Heath Ledger's is, Kefka doesn't kill himself at the end.
I thought my jokes were bad.
I highly recommend that you play the Pixel Remaster on Steam if you've never played this game, or get your hands on a copy that you can play on the SNES Classic. This game is a work of art. Don't miss it. Now, I'll be honest. I didn't play much of The Witcher or its sequel, The Witcher 2. But when I saw the trailers for The Witcher 3, I knew it was a game I absolutely could not skip. And while it was released all the way back in 2015, I think it still counts as a more modern game. And as we all know, games of quality, let alone a game that would make it into, my top 10 list of the best RPGs of all time, is very rare in this age of AAA dog shit that seems to spew from the tainted fountains of all these corporations. The Witcher 3, though, is an absolute masterpiece with a very dark and kind of desperate world that it takes place in. A very good skill and crafting system on top of its absolutely near flawless narrative. The Witcher 3 is one of just a handful of games released in the past 2 decades that actually got me invested in the characters, in its world, in its plot, and actually made me feel something other than the desire for my soul to just leave my body after wasting $60. While the combat itself is barely above being mid, in my opinion, everything else about this game completely makes up for it. You truly feel connected to this game's world and the characters in a way not seen since, the 16-bit era. The game also does a fantastic job of making sure you did not need to play the previous entries to understand what was going on, while simultaneously making you actually want to go back and buy and play them anyway just to get more context. If you've not played this game yet, promptly punch yourself in the dick and then go out and buy it on Steam or on the Xbox or PlayStation stores, because it's worth every single solitary penny. All right, time for the first and only ARPG that made it on the list. And it definitely deserves the high spot that I'm giving it. Few sequels have managed to do better than the award-winning and genre-creating games that spawned them, but this one did it. I think you know what game I'm talking about. Diablo II. No other game I can think of has done what Diablo II did for an entire genre. Literally every ARPG that has come out since Diablo II has attempted to copy or capture the essence of what Diablo II did, much in the same way that side-scrolling like adventure games copy Super Metroid to this day. Now, Diablo 1 was a masterpiece in its own right and started the entire genre of like the dark gothic ARPG. Diablo 2 then managed to come along and be better than Diablo 1 in practically every single way. Better combat, way better story, even more gory and gothic, a way better soundtrack, and the leveling and skills and rune word systems and the loot systems put everything about Diablo 1's to shame. Diablo 2 has since had a remaster, which is also really good, but the OG is still played by tens of thousands of people today. No other game in the genre has come close to recreating what Diablo 2 did. Its darkness, its desperation, and the overall mood this game sets up is unparalleled. I mean, this game will fuck your mother and then write a dark poem about it and make you read it. I can't fully explain how much this game deserves this high spot on my list. Diablo 3 and Diablo 4 improved on the genre and the franchise in some ways, but completely failed in others. And until I see, what a game, for example, like Path of Exile 2 brings in December, Diablo 2 is still the reigning champion of the ARPG genre. Okay, now we're up to the top 3. Now, as I said earlier, most of these games were all fighting for positions, and the top 3, however, were never in question for me. So let's just go right into it with number 3. This selection should come as no surprise. And when I say Final Fantasy VII, no, I'm not talking about this piece of shit. Let's pretend these things don't exist because it shouldn't. See my other reviews about it if you want to know why. As you can see, Kingdom Hearts isn't anywhere on this list, and my list has no belts covering it, so by default, Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth are disqualified. Moving on. Final Fantasy VII, in my opinion, is the greatest Final Fantasy out of all the numbered Final Fantasy titles. This game came out in 1997, and I was 14 at the time. I can't even begin to explain how much of an impact this game had on my childhood and as my development as a human as a whole. I mean, at the time of release, one of the reviews printed it was literally quite possibly the greatest game ever made, unquote. And here's the crazy thing. That statement could still be true today. Final Fantasy VII was the first 3D Final Fantasy game, and it revolutionized the series in a way that no previous Final Fantasy game did or could do. This game alone contributed to the massive sales of the Sony PlayStation. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a major reason I went for the PlayStation over the Nintendo 64 at the time. Upon release, it sold more copies than any previous Final Fantasy title, and for a long while before the advent of digital game sales, it remained one of the best-selling video games of all time. Final Fantasy VII is still the second best-selling Final Fantasy title in the numbered series ever released, just under Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy VII had an amazing cast of characters, a deep narrative that constantly kept you guessing and put you on your toes, and had one of the most devastatingly impactful events to ever occur in a video game in Aerith's death. The soundtrack is arguably the best soundtrack out of all the Final Fantasy games, and the somber and lonely feel the game gave overall throughout its entirety really immersed you into its world. And while the graphics seem very dated today, there is a charming nostalgia to them when you go back and play the original again. If you haven't played the OG FF7, you better get on that. It's available on Steam, and there are even mods where you can update the graphics, if you're a Gen Z pussy that refuses to play the games with any games that have outdated visuals. The OG game is also available on the PlayStation Store. So drop Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Remake and play a real man's game. Get the OG game. It's the journey of an absolute lifetime. Hard to fully express how much of a masterpiece this game is. Final Fantasy Tactics was the game that pushed me over the edge into getting a PlayStation instead of a Nintendo 64. Many people say that playing an RPG is like reading a book, which is one of its main draws when you compare it to other genres. Final Fantasy Tactics is literally a book that you're playing through. A story taught about the past through a narrator. Now, it's extremely common for RPGs to have a lot of fantasy elements such as magic, dragons, alternate dimensions, etc. And Final Fantasy Tactics is no exception. However, this game somehow managed to be more realistic and more grounded in its themes and ideas of actual history than any other game I've ever played. Final Fantasy Tactics encompasses real issues such as government and religious corruption and the damage their propaganda does on society, especially when they're part of a story that's essentially a battle for the throne that all the normies in the world don't actually stand or see the depth of what's actually at stake or what's going on. Sound familiar today? The strategical, tactic-based combat may not be for everyone, but man, I have yet to play a game that has such depth in its character design and narrative than this game. As with all Final Fantasy games, the music score is absolutely beautiful and sets the tone in every scene perfectly. This game is quite literally like playing through a narrative akin to Game of Thrones seasons 1 through 4, not the rest. We all know how those pieces of shit turned out.
Fuck.
Anyway, if you've not played this game, I suggest you get off your fat ass and play it. It is somewhat hard to find since it was only made available on the PlayStation, and the War of the Lions version, which was released later, came with cutscenes and better dialogue translations, and it was released on the PSP. However, emulation is the easiest and a free way to get your hands on this game. Don't miss this extraordinary gem that many surprisingly haven't even played. All right. Here we are, about to hit number 1. But before I go into number 1, I think it's fair to mention some honorable mentions that were fighting their way to get into the top 10 and just didn't quite squeeze in there. So I wanted to mention a few games that were right on the tails in this top 10 list. And I have my list up here on my other monitor, so forgive the lack of eye contact. But the honorable mentions I have listed were Dragon Age Origins, fantastic game. I didn't include the Elder Scrolls or the Fallout series because I think they kind of fall into a category on their own, being massively open world. And I know that's kind of similar to Witcher 3, which did make it, but let's be real, like the small stories in Fallout and in games like Skyrim and the open world free roaming experience are what kind of make them what they are, as opposed to a huge narrative. So I didn't think they belonged on this list, but they are worth mentioning. Legend of Dragoon for PlayStation. I know there's a lot of fans of that. That was close to making the list. The Breath of Fire series. I didn't include any of the Souls game because, again, much like the Elder Scrolls, they kind of fall into their own category of Souls-born games. So games like Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring and whatnot. But I thought they deserved at least a mention here. Baldur's Gate series, fantastic. It was really close to squeaking in. The Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening for the Game Boy, was a contender for sure. And, of course, and I did mention it in my list, but it didn't quite make the list, Final Fantasy IV. But let's not, cock tease any further, and let's go in to number 1. Now, to preface, When I first walked into a furniture store that also had a video game rental section back in the small town I grew up in the 90s, nothing could have prepared me for the absolute godsend of a game that was about to cross my path. I'd not even heard of this game before, hadn't seen it in any magazines or anything like that. But the name Squaresoft on the cover of the box made me think, well, it's got to be decent at least, right? So I rented it. And the rest, as they say, is history. If you recall, I said earlier that not only is it nearly impossible to implement time travel into any narrative and make it work, but it's just as difficult to have it be the main theme of your entire story. Chrono Trigger did what no other game has been able to do on this level, and it did it when gaming was still ultimately in its infancy. Chrono Trigger pushed the limits of the SNES with 32-bit graphics like no other game on the console ever did. Add to it the artwork of Akira Toriyama, also the most memorable and riveting musical score of almost any RPG ever, and a narrative that takes you across the flow of time to prevent a cataclysmic event that destroys all of mankind, and you have a near-perfect damn RPG. Chrono Trigger even managed to do all of this while keeping the main protagonist, Chrono, completely mute. You know how Link is in the Zelda franchise, enabling the players themselves to project themselves onto the main character in a way that no other Squaresoft JRPG had done up to this point. Now, let's also not forget the amazing take on JRPG combat that they put in this game, allowing your characters to learn new abilities depending on what combination of characters you have in your party, doing combo attacks and heals that made the fights incredibly fun and engaging. Add to that a cast of characters with interesting backstories and the fact that the choices you make in the game actually have an impact on the game world itself and which ending you'll get when you do finally beat the game. And you get a game that's truly a once in a lifetime product. I mean, a Chrono Trigger to this day can't be beat. And even Square themselves tried with a sequel to the game, which came out later, called Chrono Cross, which has an amazing soundtrack, but aside from that, is a huge piece of dog shit. I'm not kidding when I say this game is not only the best RPG of all time, but could contend with the title of best video game of all time, in my humble opinion. In the same way that Hamlet is studied by playwrights and actors, and Back to the Future is studied by screenwriters and filmgoers as being the most structurally flawless works of storytelling in theater and film respectively, Chrono Trigger should be studied in the same manner when it comes to structure of storytelling in an RPG, especially where time travel is involved. If you haven't played it, and you call yourself an RPG fan, stop watching this video and get your head checked, and then proceed to get a copy and experience this near flawless masterpiece. Anyway, guys, that wraps up my top 10 RPGs of all time. I'm curious to know if any of the games that you consider the best RPGs of all time made it onto my list. Do you disagree with my list? Do you agree? What changes would you make? Comments down below. Again, guys, apologies for the delay in content on this channel. I've been dealing with some issues with the old dog. He's doing better now, but there was a bit there. It really wasn't look like he was going to make it, but he pulled through. So I've been busy, and as you all know, I don't make content unless it's something I actually give a shit about. And in this day and age, there's not a whole lot I actually give a shit about, but you guys are one of them. One of the things I do give a shit about. So anyway, leave your comments, not content. I guess if you have content, you can do that too, but leave your comments down below. Tell me what you think. And as always, my friends, keep it real.